Today I decided to do my presentation on the 1973 Chilean coup d'etat. The 1973 Chilean coup d'etat was a military coup against the Chilean government that resulted in the overthrow of President Salvador Allende's government. So before I get into how the U.S. intervened with the government of Chile during this period, it's important for me, I think, to discuss why Allende was a challenge to the U.S. and why the U.S. decided to become involved in that region. So in 1970, Salvador Allende was elected to be the next president of Chile. It's important to point out the fact that Salvador Allende was democratically elected with a plurality, and then that plurality went into a runoff in which the Chilean Congress decided to elect Salvador Allende. So this was a completely democratic process that followed the Constitution. But despite this, the U.S. still had issues with his presidency for two primary reasons. The first one is Cold War tensions. So this was, of course, in the peak of the Cold War, 1970. Vietnam War was going on, and tensions with the Soviet Union were very, very high. And Salvador Allende was, like a lot of leaders in South America at this time, leftist. So he had socialist ideals that he wanted to implement in Chile. So this ideological conflict was very strong. During the Cold War, the United States feared communism spreading throughout all the world, but especially in Latin America. This was when Cuba was turning communist, and they felt very threatened that our neighbors in the South were turning leftist and communist. In the United States, the conservatives that were in power during this time, Nixon's presidency, were extra wary of leftism spreading into South America because unlike the liberals in the United States, this contradicted their ideology very strongly, or more strongly, I should say. And the second concern was economic concerns, and this ties in with Salvador Allende's ideology as a socialist, because Salvador Allende was fighting, and a lot of his platform was based on redistribution of wealth and the nationalization of Chilean copper mines. So during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the United States and their companies were very highly invested into the copper mines of Chile. The three main copper mines at the time were the Chuquicamata, El Salvador, and El Teniente. The first two that I mentioned were owned by the Anaconda Copper Company, and the third one, El Teniente, was owned by the Kennecott Copper Corporation. Both of these companies were American, and both of these companies were heavily involved with lobbying in the U.S. government and were very connected in the U.S. and contributed to the GDP of the United States in a very major way. But Salvador Allende was a threat to this because he wanted to nationalize these copper mines. So once he was elected in 1970, he worked to nationalize these copper mines in a process called Chileanization. The Chileanization essentially means that instead of United States companies owning these copper mines, the Chilean government would step in and sort of take the property and begin using them with the Chilean government owning them instead of the U.S. companies. So it's been made clear why Allende was a challenge to the United States at this time, and the United States intelligence agencies, aka the CIA, chose to interfere with this through multiple different methods of intervention. The first method is economic pressure. So through agencies, again, like the CIA and the State Department, they sought to destabilize Chile's economy. So after Salvador Allende was elected, they began cutting off and reducing economic aid, imposing economic sanctions, and pressuring international organizations like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund to withhold any sort of assistance to Chile. This was very major for the Chilean economy, as the United States has such a strong impact on the global economy and on trade. So by having economic sanctions away from them, placed on them, their exports were severely damaged. Furthermore, the U.S. has strong ties with the World Bank and IMF, so their wishes were taken very seriously by the World Bank and IMF. And again, Chilean economy suffered during this time period, which in Chile weakened support for Salvador Allende. One of the right-wing candidates for presidency against Salvador Allende was actually heavily funded by United States intelligence groups. And this again bolstered domestic opposition to Allende's policies. Furthermore, they did it through propaganda and psychological warfare. So not only did they fund opposition groups and decrease support by Allende by making the economy suffer, they also funded propaganda that would contribute to this idea and further discredit Allende and his government, reducing the government's legitimacy. This fostered dissent and made it easier later for the military to overthrow the government, because the military was able to build support with those conservative groups that opposed Allende. Thus, with citizen support, overthrowing the government was more easy for them. And furthermore, the U.S. provided military assistance, and this was done by showing strong support to the Chilean military, who came into power under General Pinochet. And this military assistance, training, equipment, and funding increased the relationship with the military in Chile and the U.S. government. And it was under General Pinochet that the military was able to overthrow the Chilean government. And then the final piece of involvement from the U.S. is direct involvement with the coup. So it was made clear with intelligence reports that the U.S. was aware of the coup planning and provided support to Chilean military leaders that were eventually involved in the coup. Documents declassified in later years revealed that the U.S. Was involved in coup preparations, including financial aid and logistical support. So through all these methods, the United States was able to A, discredit Salvador Allende and his government, and B, provide the Chilean military with the means and methods of overthrowing Salvador Allende's government. Beginning in the years following the coup and going all the way into the current times, the news of U.S. involvement began to go public. There were two main ways in which the American public became aware of this. And first was the Church Report. The Church Report is a report that the Church Committee did on the CIA operations, and this revealed the U.S.'s relationship with the American companies in Chile and shows that they directly did fund opponents and reveal all of the methods that I just went over in the previous slide. And the Church Report is very in-depth, and this was released in the 70s. Although parts of it are still heavily classified and blacked out, you can still read between the lines, and many organizations and newspapers began reporting on this event, which the public sort of, was not very fond of, and there was significant domestic backlash towards U.S. involvement in Chile. In 2000, more documents were released, specifically one in which the CIA admitted to its role in the 1970 kidnapping and killing of Rene Schneider, who was the commander-in-chief of the Chilean army and who had refused to use the army to stop Allende's inauguration. So essentially, in 1970, there was an attempted coup, and there was a kidnapping and killing of someone who was at least opposed to military intervention in the Chilean government. This shows that the United States did at one time support a coup 3 years before the actual one occurred, the successful one occurred, and it also shows that they were willing to use violence against Salvador Allende and those that stood with him. Further declassified documents released in 2023 show that Nixon and the Secretary of State at the time, Henry Kissinger, had branded Allende as a dangerous communist and were aware of the military's plans in 1973 to overthrow Allende just days before the coup d'etat actually occurred. This shows the United States was aware that the coup would happen, was involved in Chile, and still allowed it to happen, which indicates that they did want this coup to happen. So for my conclusion and, why this event is important, this event had implications both domestically in the United States and abroad in Chile. First, it affected Chile in a very severe way. The 1973 coup marked when Augusto Pinochet, the military dictator in Chile, came into power. And for the rest of the 20th century, where Pinochet was in power, there were major human rights violations in Chile, as well as the loss of democracy in Chile. And these Pinochet and the U.S.'s support of Pinochet are heavily, heavily criticized, again, because of these disregard for human rights. This event was also important for the U.S. because it showed that U.S. intervention abroad can be harmful, especially if the motivations and reasons for it are bad. So in this case, the way in which the CIA and State Department acted abroad had direct negative effects, and it shows that the U.S. was able to put economic and political motivations over human rights and maintaining democracy abroad. Thus, the 1973 Chilean coup and the U.S.'s involvement in it serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of foreign intervention and the impact of geopolitical interests on domestic policies. It underscores the ethical dilemmas faced by governments when balancing strategic objectives and economic motivations with respect for sovereignty and human rights.